incredibly important conversation led by dedicated Black trans advocates who are already doing the work day in and day out to remind us that Black trans lives matter. Defending Black trans lives in Virginia is an integral part of their lives, not only in the work that they do, but also in their lived experiences. We hope that this dialogue will open our eyes to the work that is being done and the work that needs to be done in order to reach a state of true equality. It is my pleasure to welcome our facilitator, Aurora Higgs, who is a Black queer activist who uses performance as her means of storytelling. Aurora has worked in the space of social justice in Richmond for over a decade and hopes to make her community a place that fosters empowerment for those who rarely get it. Currently, she's working on obtaining her doctorate in media studies with a concentration on queer representation. Please join me in welcoming our facilitator, Aurora, and our panelists, Dexter, Nathaniel, and Sarah. Take it away.
Thank you so much, Endai. Hi, everyone. My name is Aurora Higgs. My pronouns are she, her, and they, them. And I am extremely happy to be a part of this panel, to be a part of TIES, and just to be a part of this community. TIES is really important to me and was one of the first places I got to experience a transgender family reunion / block party / convention. I think, especially as a person of color, I am so excited to be a part of this panel, defending Black lives in Virginia, or Black trans lives in Virginia, I should say. And yes, so let's go ahead and get into it. I'll read the bios for our esteemed panelists. And before we get started, I do just want to say, I would like for us to just take a brief moment of silence to honor the Black and brown trans people who are no longer with us. And in particular, I do want to shout out to Angel Rose, a beautiful trans woman that I met last year at TIES and had a beautiful relationship with until she passed away shortly after meeting her. And when I think about TIES and I think about her, I get really emotional, and I want to honor her and all of the people who should be here with us and are not. So just a brief moment of silence, if you wouldn't mind. Okay, so I'd also love for you to say the names of the people who are no longer here at some point today. It's a way to keep them alive in our hearts. And I also want to honor the people who are with us and celebrate those who are still here making a change as contemporaries. First on the panel, we'll have Dexter Davis, he, him pronouns. Dexter is a proud Black transgender man who is actively involved in uplifting his communities. His passion led him to become a facilitator for multiple transgender support groups, including Transcending Empowered Aspiring Men, TEAM for short, a support group at Nations Foundation for Men of Trans Experience, and founding the Men in Transition, a nonprofit social support organization dedicated to serving the unique needs of transgender men and transmasculine people within Hampton Roads in Virginia. He is a dedicated member of the Alpha Colony of Alpha Omega Kappa Fraternity, Inc., which is a non-collegiate Greek-lettered organization of men of trans experience focused on fellowship, service, and leadership. He is also a member of Equality Virginia's Transgender Advocacy Speakers Bureau. Give a hand for Dexter. Thank you, Dexter, for joining us. Next on the panel, we have Nathaniel Preston, he, him pronouns. Nathaniel grew up in Martinsville, Virginia, but now lives in Roanoke. He works as a case manager for a national auto supply chain to help people with leaves of absence. He is also active in his community, which includes gearing up to start an LGBT Chamber of Commerce for the Roanoke area with his wife, and being a member of Equality Virginia's Transgender Advocacy Speakers Bureau. He also has 3 children in their teenage and early adulthood years, as well as 3 dogs. In his spare time, he enjoys spending time with family, cooking, reading, and playing video games. So if we could give a brief round of applause for Nathaniel. And last but not least, we have Sarah Simone, she, her pronouns. Sarah grew up in eastern Pennsylvania, but now lives in Northern Virginia. She is a case manager working with homeless veterans of the U.S. military. In her spare time, she enjoys poetry, writing, and hiking. She is involved with several local LGBT organizations in her area and a founding member of Equality Virginia's Transgender Advocacy Speakers Bureau. So thank you so much to our esteemed panelists, and again, thank you all so much for being here. Because we're kind of limited on time, let's just go ahead and get right into the panel questions. And I would like to invite anyone who would like to answer these to just unmute yourself and give us your take on it. So we have about 4 pre-prepared questions, and then we will likely have time at the end for some Q&A. And please don't forget to type your questions into the Q&A box and any general comments or concerns in the chat box. So for our panelists, what motivates your advocacy for Black, trans, and non-binary communities? Who has uplifted you and prepared you for this work? Anyone feel free to jump in.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I thought about this question and how to present the answer that really gets to the depths of my feelings as to what motivates my advocacy. I did create a visual presentation, but I'm not able to show that here. I could say what motivates me are my own experiences in my journey as a trans woman of color. There were great experiences of how I felt about myself after I transitioned and left behind literal decades, which included suicide attempts of me trying to be someone that I was not for literally decades. I also could say that what motivates me are the negative experiences as a trans woman of color facing a society that demonstrated the face of hate and bigotry. Those first 2 years that I was full-time as a trans woman of color, finding myself the survivor of homelessness, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, domestic violence, assault, terror, and I am a survivor of rape and post-traumatic stress disorder. I could say that motivates me to help people. I could also say what motivates me is a love I found from a community of people who would not let me fall and lifted me up when I didn't feel hope for myself. And I give one example of that. After some years of on and off of homelessness that included the pain I discussed earlier, I finally found stable job and stable housing, and I lived in a shared house in Alexandria, Virginia. I lived in places before that weren't so nice in the past, I had to face the threat of violence and transphobic slurs, even just walking to the store. But now I was in Alexandria, a diverse neighborhood. What could go wrong? I lived there for 2.5 years when one of my housemates, a male, discovered that I was a transgender person. And my life changed that day. Everything I thought about that neighborhood in Alexandria, Virginia changed. I was still recovering from PTSD, and I was not ready for what happened. I was called names, gay slurs, you know the names that start with the letter F. But it wasn't just that. There was a hatred in his voice that was palpable. He indicated in so many words that he himself felt tainted for sharing a house with a mother effing F. I've been called many names before, As a person of color, I've heard the N-word from white people when I was young. But on this day, in this house, with this individual, I felt particularly vulnerable. He indicated that the neighborhood, the surrounding neighborhood, the neighborhood that I lived in, wanted him to do something about me. They did not want a transgender person in that neighborhood. They left it up to him to rectify the situation. It was a moment based in the heart of anger and sheer hatred, juxtaposed to the pressure others had applied to him and his own feelings of inadequacy, that I knew this was an extremely dangerous situation, something I may not survive. I did not want to be one of the names called on Transgender Day of Remembrance. During my transition, I was just tired of the fights, of how people saw me, their anger, the threats that accompanied me for several years of my transition. At this stage of my life, in my transition, I just wanted peace. A community of trans people and cis allies reached out to me, and 3 days later, I was located into a new neighborhood where I was accepted totally, and a housing situation I'm in now that is ideal compared to housing situations I've been in the past. So I can say the love of these friends are what motivate me. But the truth be told, my main motivation are the sisters and brothers we have lost to violence. The majority of them are trans women of color, people who look like me. I really need to illustrate this point of how deep I feel about this. These are the names of those forgotten people. Not only their names will I read, but I must read what happened to them so you can understand. If you think about the world that we live in today, you think about what happened to George Floyd. People didn't believe that people of color were being assaulted, brutalized, and killed by the police until they saw that video. When they saw that video, lives were changed, and society hopefully started to change because people saw what was happening. So it's important to not only read the names, but to understand what's happening to us, to understand what really motivates me. It's only October, and unfortunately, by the year's end, there will be more names added to this list. People who don't know today that they will be added to this list. This year has been the most violent year for trans people in the United States. These are the names and what happened to them. Yampi Arocho, 19 years old, trans woman of color, fatally shot. Monica Diamond, 34 years old, trans woman of color, fatally shot. Lexi, 33-year-old trans woman of color, stabbed to death. Joanna Metzger, white trans woman of color, fatally stabbed. Nina Pop, 28-year-old trans woman of color, stabbed multiple times to death. Helen O'Regan, 20-year-old white trans woman, stabbed to death. Dominique Fells, 27-year-old trans woman of color, murdered, her remains found in the river. Tony McDade, 38-year-old trans man of color, fatally shot. Rhea Milton, 25 years old, trans woman of color, shot to death. Melusa Ruiz, 28-year-old trans woman of color, fatally shot. Jane Thompson, 33-year-old white trans woman, shot to death. Selena Hernandez, 37-year-old trans woman of color, shot multiple times. Brian Powers, 43-year-old trans man of color, fatally shot. Brayla Stone, only 17 years old, fatally shot. Marsha Mack, 22-year-old trans woman of color, fatally shot. Serena Ramos, 32-year-old trans woman of color, shot and set on fire. Leila Perez Sanchez, 21-year-old Latina trans woman, shot and set on fire. Penelope Ramirez, beaten and hanged to death. Sheikha Peters, 32-year-old trans woman of color, fatally shot. Bree Black, 27-year-old trans woman of color, fatally shot. Summer Taylor, 24-year-old white non-binary person, intentionally run over, murdered. Marilyn Cazares, trans woman of color, stabbed to death and set on fire. Tiffany Harris, 32-year-old trans woman of color, stabbed to death. Queza Hardy, 22-year-old trans woman of color, fatally shot. Asia Rose Spears, 32-year-old trans woman of color, stabbed to death. Key Sam, 24-year-old trans woman of color, fatally shot. Aria Burnett, 37-year-old trans woman of color, fatally shot. Mia Green, 29-year-old trans woman of color, fatally shot. Michelle Ramos Vargas, 33-year-old trans woman of color, fatally shot. Felicia Harris, 33-year-old trans woman of color, fatally shot. Brooklyn Deshuna, 20-year-old trans woman of color, fatally shot. Dustin Parker, 25-year-old white trans man, fatally shot. To answer this first question, this is why I try to do what I do to help, to try to end this violence. Because not only has it happened to our brothers and sisters and all of those that I mentioned already this year in the middle of October, it could happen to any one of us before this year's end.
Sarah, thank you so much for that. And I know we have someone in the chat who wants to know if you would mind sending that list out.
I would send it out.
Thank you so much. Like you said, this has been an unprecedented number of murders of Black and brown trans women since we've started recording, and we know that we haven't really been keeping track of these numbers for very long, and hopefully this vigilance that we and the metrics that we're now using can send the message of our vulnerability and our violations in society. So thank you so much. I really appreciate that.